Russia intends to test the unity of the West, particularly Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. This was stated by the head of Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, Bruno Kahl. In the Kremlin's vision, NATO's influence should be weakened in the future, while Moscow's sphere of influence should expand further westward, ideally without the presence of the United States in Europe.
We very much hope this is not true and that we will not be put in the difficult position of it being tested. However, we must assume that Russia wants to test us, to put the unity of the West to the test. Bruno Kahl, president of the Federal Intelligence Service, from a publication in DPA International.
The Kremlin has described EU initiatives to increase military aid to Ukraine as a deliberate prolongation of the war. Russian Federation Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova labeled the EU a militarized alliance, ultimately aiming to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War argue that by spreading such disinformation, Moscow seeks to divert attention from its own long-term preparation for war with the West.
Zakharova's comments ignore an ongoing Kremlin effort to rally domestic support for the war in Ukraine and justify Russia's long-term efforts to militarize Russian society by claiming that Russia is fighting a proxy war with the West in Ukraine and must prepare for a future war with the West, from a report by the Institute for the Study of War.
Russia's efforts to strengthen its military presence in Belarus, expand its military capabilities, and militarize society indicate preparations for potential aggression against NATO countries, analysts say. Significant resources are also being allocated by Moscow to conduct hybrid operations in Europe. Lithuanian intelligence reported that during the 2024 elections, Russia mobilized the highest possible number of pro-Russian voters in Lithuania.
According to intelligence assessments, Russia is focusing on major Western nations or those where pro-Russian political forces hold significant influence. In the medium term, Russia may attempt to exploit this vulnerability in Lithuanian society to increase its influence over political processes, particularly if pro-Russian sentiments gain more traction, from the Delphi publication.
The aggressive war waged by Russia against Ukraine and its consequences pose a threat to European and global security, European leaders stated. At a summit in Brussels, they endorsed a plan for EU rearmament and increased support for Kyiv. Polish President Andrzej Duda insists that all NATO countries must immediately raise their defense spending to at least 3% of GDP. Poland itself not only plans to increase funding for its defense industry, but also to more than double the size of its army. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk announced that the government is drafting a military training program for all men of conscription age. Additionally, Warsaw is considering withdrawing from international conventions that ban the production, stockpiling and use of anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions.
I support a favorable stance on Poland's withdrawal from the Ottawa Convention and possibly from the Dublin Convention. I am referring here to landmines and cluster munitions. There's no point in deceiving ourselves. There is nothing pleasant about this. We all know that. The problem is that those we might fear already have these weapons.
Poland and Denmark are considering French President Emmanuel Macron's initiative to expand nuclear deterrence, the prime ministers of both countries stated. Macron proposed using France's nuclear arsenal to protect the entire continent from Russian threats.
Let's assess the situation realistically. Why have Europeans and other nations found themselves in this position regarding Ukraine for the past 3 years? Because the aggressor is a nuclear armed state. Therefore, it is entirely legitimate for Europe to consider nuclear deterrence for itself.
France ranks fourth in the world in terms of the number of nuclear warheads, possessing 290. Only the United States, Russia and China China have more. Furthermore, France is the only nuclear-armed state within the European Union. The United Kingdom, which is no longer an EU member but seeks closer ties with Brussels, has an estimated 225 nuclear warheads. Reported by Katerina Bastun, Natalia Husak, Volodymyr Stunhelov, UATV News.
Not to praise Trump personally, Russian propagandists have received new instructions from the Kremlin on how to talk about US President Donald Trump. The reason for this shift is the ongoing negotiations between the US and Russia. Unlike previous American presidents, radical criticism of Trump is now off limits. According to the Verstka media, citing sources close to the Putin administration, propagandists have not received strict directives to present the supposed warming of US-Russia relations in a particular way. However, they have been ordered to maintain a so-called balance in their reporting as the negotiations could ultimately stall.
An employee of a major state media outlet described the new content policy as follows: "We don't make promises about the end of the special military operation. We don't give any deadlines. The main thing is that they have made contact and we are ready to listen." An insider working for the state TV channel said that there are no instructions to force anything. It is only necessary to balance Trump with statements from the Russian side. From the Verstka article.
Every authoritarian regime needs an external enemy. For Russia, this enemy has always been the West, and now specifically Europe. During a recent meeting between US President and French President Emmanuel Macron discussed the possibility of NATO spending troops to Ukraine. In response, Russian propaganda outlets launched a wave of insults directed at Macron. However, experts believe that the Kremlin's temporary thaw towards the US will not last long.
They are not rushing to embrace Trump, fully understanding that today things are one way, and tomorrow they may be completely different. The general directive is to leave Americans alone for now, focus on the British, the French, the Germans, but don't touch the Americans. During Trump's first presidency, Margarita Simonian once declared she would drive around Moscow waving an American flag in celebration. However, even back then, Trump's presidency did not turn out well for Russian propagandists.
After Macron and Trump's negotiations, Putin immediately gave an interview to Russian media. The Russian dictator claimed that Russia supposedly has more resources than Ukraine. Russia decided to become a raw materials supplier to the United States after propagandists mocked the negotiation process between the United States and Ukraine on rare earth metals. In this agreement, Putin seems to have seen prospects for major deals with the US.
People are confused. The blatant sale of rare earth metals and the possibility of handing them over to the U.S., it's too much. Some pro-Kremlin bloggers support it, others don't. Many still don't grasp what's happening. But the overall reaction is delayed because, historically, no American president has ever truly benefited Russia.
Russian propaganda is now contradicting itself and falling apart. The objectives of the so-called special military operation are increasingly unclear, putting pro-war mobilization efforts at risk. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the imposition of Western sanctions, Russian media has insisted that domestic production could replace Western goods. Sanctions have included bans on Russian oil and petroleum imports, asset freezes for major Russian companies, financial restrictions and export bans on technology and dual-use goods. As a result, Russia now lacks airplane components, military equipment repair is idle, and losses from sanctions are at all-time high. In 2024, the budget deficit in Russia amounted to 3.5 billion rubles.
Russia's economic situation is dire. The so-called lifeline Trump is throwing may well turn into an anchor. We no longer understand the logic, why this war was fought for 3 years, why 350,000 men were mobilized and sent to the trenches, why over 1 million signed military contracts, why there are hundreds of thousands of dead, wounded, and missing, and why millions have become refugees.
According to Bloomberg, Putin's special representative for foreign economic cooperation, Kirill Dmitriev, is using business proposals to pressure the US into a deal favorable to the Kremlin. The goal is to lift sanctions on Russia. Dmitriev proposed that Putin sell around 2 million tons of Siberian aluminium to the US in exchange for Trump lifting import restrictions. He also suggested that Russian companies could set up joint ventures with American firms for aluminium production. Reported by Sergei Kulyas, Victoria Smirnova, UATV News.